Roger Cohen needs no introduction, given his capacity to fill a room, but I've typed one out, so he'll get one. He is the New York Times Paris bureau chief, and he was recently awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the war in Ukraine. Roger has also been awarded many other honors, such as the Légion d'honneur from the French Republic and the Eric and Amy Berger Award from the Overseas Press Club of America. Jacques Rupnik was educated at the Sorbonne and at Harvard. He is currently research professor at Sciences Po in Paris and visiting professor at the College of Europe in Brussels. He is our resident expert in European politics tonight, so he'll be a nice counterpoint to an American voice. It's perfect. You all, I'm sure, already are aware of An Affirming Flame, but if you haven't read it yet, it is a wonderful, thoughtful collection of columns from Cohen's long career at the New York Times. It spans Tehran, China, Cairo, Ukraine, Vietnam, Gaza, and more. Roger is an incredibly skillful world traveler. He considers all perspectives. And what I'm really struck by is the reflective spirit at the center of this work and his capacity for reflection upon American identity today. That's a question that we here at the library are asking ourselves at every moment. And so it's really a privilege to be able to host a conversation like this tonight. Roger, Jacques, thank you so much for joining us. Can we have a round of applause?
Is it working? Yeah. So I fully, I'm Jacques Rupnik and I approve this message. But there is one thing I would add to the message is that this book is not just a collection of Roger Cohen's columns in the New York Times. That's part of the book. But there's half of the book which is not been published in the New York Times, which is a splendid essay written, I guess, during the COVID period, because this was a kind of time when we were all meditating. It's called Meditation on Politics, Life and Politics. Well, that's what the pandemic provided us with. And I would say, don't take this book as just the collection of essays. Take it as read with the opening essay, essay in the French sense. The French invented the essay, Montaigne, very personal and very universal. Well, Roger's writing is in that range, often very personal, and the issues, the lines of questioning are universal. So, yeah, that would be my small footnote to what Emily very rightly said. My role here will be very modest. I will mainly be trying to make few observations or ask questions to Roger, and then you will, of course, have the opportunity to do so. There is embarrassment of riches. You don't know where to start. I would say the strongest, what's original here from my point is a certain idea of journalism. A certain idea of journalism which is both closer to what a writer is doing and at the same time a close observer on the ground. In fact, this is a phrase Roger uses, I think, from a war correspondent he knew in Bosnia, that war is an opportunity to see people from below, the situation from below. And I think that this is what you get because he's a great traveler, and he will tell us perhaps something. I mean, he's just spent a month in Russia, not, quite unique. So he's a great traveler, was on the ground in Bosnia. In fact, this is when I first got to know Roger. We were discussing I think here in Paris. This was the time at the Bosnian War. I was working for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for the International Commission, and Roger was, of course, the had experience on the ground. He spent, 2 years writing about that, not to mention the book he wrote after, Hearts Grown Brutal. And I had to read many books about the war in Bosnia. Well, that's the one I keep at close range when I want to get to us. But what I wanted to say is that you get that, of course, you had that view from below, what the war correspondent whose name now I forgot.
Martha Gellhorn.
Martha Gellhorn. So and that's very true. You have the view from below, but you also have then the bigger picture, the view from above. How is it viewed? The grand strategies, the ideas behind it all. So that reminds me of the great events you can see in two ways. You take any of them, but if you take the Battle of Waterloo, you have Victor Hugo, his view, great history made by great man, Napoleon, Blücher, Wellington, etc. And then you have Stendhal, Fabrice à Waterloo, and he's wandering through the landscape after the battle and gives you the view from below. And I think that what is unique about Roger's writing is this combination of the two. I'm not saying he's Victor Hugo and Stendhal in one man. That may, but you see the point I'm making. I must be brief, and therefore I will skip a number of things about. Well,
ask me a question, Jack.
And yeah, well,
that's my advice as a journalist.
Okay, the first question concerns America, and you quote Hofstadter saying that the fate of America is not to have an ideology, but to be one. Is it still the case? Is America still united by its constitution, its ideology of the founding fathers? We see a deeply divided country. I don't have to stress that to this audience. So my question is, what is your view? There are basically two views. Either you say this is no longer holds true and America is so deeply divided as never before, etc., or you put the emphasis on the capacity of institution to their resilience, to adapt, to sustain the shocks, etc. What is your reading?
Well, thank you very much, Jacques, for doing this. And thank you, Emily, for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for coming out on this steamy Paris night. I think we have this weather through the weekend. Before I get to the American question, I'd just like to say a word on journalism and what Jacques was talking about. It is true that I believe very passionately that the only way to do journalism is to be there, is to bear witness. And you can't bear witness from a distance. It doesn't matter how sophisticated technology has become today. It doesn't matter how much information you can glean in 30 seconds online. There is no substitute for moving into a place you've not seen before, seeing it, feeling it, smelling it, sensing it, hearing snippets of conversation that inspire some thought, reading something that causes you to look again. And there's really no substitute for looking into somebody's eyes. Sure, you can do an interview by phone, but it'll always be 20 to 30% of an interview en présentiel, as we say nowadays, when so much happens online. So I believe very strongly in that. I think journalism is immersion in place, deep immersion in place. And there are many distractions today. Just look at people. They're not looking at the world. They're looking at this. And you can't do journalism that way. And I don't think you can really write that way. at least that in my conception, which is probably very old-fashioned, of what journalism is. I think datelines and the importance of datelines is probably being diminished these days. The importance of what I've just been describing, just because there is so much out there and there's no limit on to what can be written. So the constraints of space, to some degree, have disappeared, and everybody is pontificating about a lot of things from a great distance. And it's dangerous because you can easily get it wrong. I wrestled with space for a long time as a New York Times columnist. Does in fact, I don't know if you know what the New York Times column is. Well, it's 800 words. And so there's this battle with a column, it used to be, sometimes now columns are longer, of whittling it down, you know, getting to the essence, eliminating anything that was superfluous. There's very little space in a column for description or narrative. When I was really desperate, I would console myself with the fact that Lincoln did pretty well at Gettysburg with 272 words. So surely I, in 800 words, could say something of value, at least from time to time. The other thing with the column is, you know, asking somebody to have 2 thoughts a week, that may not seem like that, 2 public thoughts a week, that is a lot. You're not going to get the ball out of the park every time. Okay. The best columns write themselves. They come from some deep place, I found, and they just flow. Most columns, however, are agonizing struggle, as is most writing. I'm sure Jacques would agree. And so it's challenging, but, you know, Oscar Wilde, I think, once wrote to a companion, say that I wrote you such a long letter, I don't have time to write you a short one. And of course, there's a lot to that. So yes, I mean, as Jacques said, I'm not a big believer in objectivity. I'm a believer in fairness. I'm a believer in trying to talk to both sides. But we are individuals, and nobody, I think, could say that my coverage of the war in Bosnia was strictly objective. Yeah, I talked to Radovan Karadzic, but I watched the Serbs shelling women and children day in, day out over a period of years. So I had strong feelings about that, and I'm sure, at least I hope, that came through in my writing, because I think a lot of the best writing is a marriage of the head and the heart. The one without the other is lesser. Now, moving to Jacques' question on the United States, I mean, I'm a naturalized American. I've been an American for about 20 years. So maybe I'm a little starry-eyed still. It's not that I don't see all the ugliness, all the violence, all the problems, all the inequality, all the racism, all the corruption of the political system, all the problems with the political system itself, the role of money, the role of social media, the shouting, the lack of dialogue, the inability to compromise, the loss of the idea that if you get 70% of what you want in life, that's pretty good, right? That's pretty good. But it's an absolutist kind of culture we live in. It's primary colors. It's cacophony, and it's very disorienting. And I think it's very difficult for all of us to keep our bearings, keep our sense of what is true and what is false, what is right, what is wrong. And a lot of that, I think, has been lost in the United States today. And the chief vehicle or protagonist of that has, of course, been former President Donald Trump, who, with the sinister political genius that he has, latched on to the fact that the United States had become a disoriented society, was a country whose relative power in the world was diminishing, was a country in the midst of an economic transition that left many people feeling marooned, feeling forgotten, we see some of the same things in France, so it's not surprising. And yes, the United States is an idea, however flawed. We know how flawed it was at the outset. All men are created equal. Yes, all men created equal, and not black men, and not the indigenous people of the United States, and so on and so on and so on. And yet, I still believe that this was a luminous idea that, taken in the round, has overall been a boon to humankind, that has freed untold numbers of people from oppression and brutality and lawlessness. And if we, the United States, lose touch with our fundamental values, with our fundamental commitment to freedom and the rule of law and open societies and truth-telling, then we are no longer ourselves. To the idea that we are a nation of immigrants. We are that. Why does America believe in second chances? Because so many people's lives in the United States began as a second chance. They came there to get a second chance. And so, unlike in France, often, where un échec, c'est la fin de tout, c'est un désastre, etc., etc., et on ne peut pas se remettre, au contraire, in the United States, I think that idea is very fundamental. So why is Donald Trump so dangerous? Because he attacks, holds us nothing, is that I just listed. He doesn't believe in any of them. What does Donald Trump believe in? What else do he believe about himself? He believes he can get away with it. And he believes he will always have his way. So why was his electoral defeat by Joe Biden in 2020, which was close? Yes, it was close. It was just as close as his own election 4 years earlier, almost. Why could he not believe it? Because it's impossible for him to conceive of such a defeat or such a setback. And I've just been in the US, and I'd been saying here in France, when people ask me, because that's the main question people ask, you know, are we going to get a rerun? Are we going to get a rerun of the orange hair and the lies, and not being able to remember Friday what you were outraged by Tuesday? Because the cascade of crazy, unthinkable, often awful things happening is so intense that it's impossible for any human being to remember, you know, what happened earlier in the week. And I was saying in front, no, in the end, Americans are, you know, in the end, people sensible enough to recognize that a former president who was behind the Jan 6 uprising, and basically a storming of the Capitol aimed at overturning our democracy, the United States was not going to vote such a man back into office, and thereby crush America as an idea. Well, after I've just been in the US for 4 days, but I'm not so sure now. I still cling to that belief, but Trump is surging in the polls as the legal challenges to him mount up. The more indictments there are, the more crimes he's accused of, the more popular he becomes. So one has to conclude that a significant chunk of the United States is in a state of internal uprising. It wants to break something. It wants to throw everything up into the air. Now, we in Europe might think that feels unfamiliar, in that we're now some distance from the 1930s. But of course, in its way, and I'm not comparing it to the 1930s, but what did a neighboring country, Britain, do? I mean, this was an expression, it was completely senseless. A normally prudent country threw itself over a cliff. I'm referring to the United Kingdom and Brexit. But there is a mood in the world today of great restiveness, and even violent restiveness. And in my view, it's quite combustible and pretty dangerous.
Just, I mean, there are so many issues in the book that one would want to discuss. I think our time is limited, so I will maybe start with what basically you chronicle in your columns is the unraveling of the post-89 world, of the post-89 international order. And that means both the crisis of democracy, but also the demise of what is sometimes called the international liberal order, though the phrase sometimes needs qualifying. The interplay between the domestic and the international, because what you've just said about January 6th. So we had 9/11. That was an external. You say it actually in your I think in the introductory essay. That was an external threat. January 6th. That's the internal threat. And the connection between, there is a connection between the two, because of course, if America is internally in the state you've just described, well, then its external role and the whole question of the kind of response the West, again, another term that needs qualifying, can provide in times of war in Europe and other challenges around the world is absolutely crucial. So how would you see the scenarios for what is to come? We have basically an international system with about three main blocks: the so-called West, divided Europe and America; the so-called East, Russia and China; and the so-called South, global South, as it's now called, whatever again that is, which is both, say, India, but also Africa. India that wants to be neutral in the war in Ukraine, and Africans who actually actively support Putin, at least the military in charge in some of those countries. So what would it take for America and Europe to respond to this new, to the demise of what we thought was the great triumph of 1989, and it was a triumph of sorts, triumph for democracy, certainly, for those of us who observed communism in Eastern Europe. But what would it take to respond to the challenges of a divided world?
Well, you ask small questions, Jacques. It can be very concisely answered.
That's because you give big answers in your books.
Well, first of all, yes. I mean, the book, in a way, is a chronicling of a erosion of a great wave of hope. There was an assumption in the 1990s that liberal democracy and those values that I just described, that they had won, and that humanity as a whole had more or less decided that, for all its manifest faults and problems, that open liberal societies, rather than closed totalitarian communist societies, provided the road to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The idea that democracy overall would provide people with greater comfort, happiness, chances of fulfillment than other closed systems. That belief has clearly eroded. We've seen a rise of autocratic rulers in Moscow, in Beijing, in wide swathes of Africa, in many parts of the world. And I think we've seen the far right, a nationalist, strong nationalist far right movement that is anti-immigrant, that is here present in France. Giorgia Meloni is the Prime Minister of Italy. Slovakia may be about to veer in that direction in its election later this month. And I think that's in part a response to the manifest failings, especially in terms of inequality and the forgotten people of the periphery outside the wired metropolises, the people who benefit from an online world. And there's been a very conspicuous failure of our democracies. I also think it's just a reflection of something deeper. People are drawn to giddying ideologies that get their blood up. If they're feeling frustrated, if they're feeling forgotten, than the designation of an enemy, however imaginary, the Nazi fascist Ukraine that happens to be led by a Jewish president. That's something new under the sun. That the potential for hatred in every human being is there, and it's powerful. And to just assume, as we did, I think, in the 1990s, okay, we've won all that. We've seen the effect of it in the 1930s, in the 1940s. We'd seen what happened in Rwanda, even Bosnia. So I think that's a naive assumption. I think democracy is inherently fragile, and that we have to be very vigilant in protecting it, and that applies very much to the United States today. So what can the West do? Well, I think the first issue is a war. There's a war in Europe. There's a war not very far from here, and perhaps 200,000 people have been killed since February 2022. And again, speaking of human nature, we tend, when something goes on and on and on, to forget things. And I think we're at an inflection point, possibly, in terms of the Western, and Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, is in Ukraine today. But there's a beginning of a feeling of, well, how long is this going to go on? And in my view, it could go on a very long time. And a frozen conflict will probably benefit Putin, because a Ukraine at war is not going to get into NATO, is not going to get into the European Union. And Peskov, when I was in Russia for a month. I don't know why they gave me a visa, but I was very lonely. I was the only US correspondent in all of Russia, and Russia is the size of the United States and Canada combined. But Peskov told me just straight out, we've annexed these 4 regions. We're not going to give them back. It's written into our constitution. Vladimir Putin won't give it back, nor the next president, the one after that, the one after that. We don't control all of those 4 territories yet, but we will. So Ukraine must accept to become a smaller nation, a neutral nation, not in NATO or the European Union, one where Russian speakers are free to use their language. And if Ukraine accepts all that, then we can speak about possible compromise. And as I just said, Russia is very big. One of the reasons it's very big is it never has actually given back any land it's conquered. I mean, that is the story of Russia. That's how it expanded to Vladivostok, and indeed to a Japanese island that, as you all know, it still occupies from the 1940s, from World War II. So you have that on one side, and on the other, faced by a brutal, an unnecessary, and unprovoked, or indirectly provoked, certainly, Russian aggression, and a Ukraine that is fighting for its life, and understandably will not cede any of what I've described. So the question, I think, for the coming year, as the US campaign goes forward, is, can the West hold together? Can the West hold out for the preservation of democracy and freedom in Ukraine? And if it doesn't, I think that is very ominous. I mean, one of the tidbits I learned in Moscow was that in the list of Americans banned from entry into Russia as of May of this year was Mr. Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, who argued with Donald Trump when he asked him to find him 23,000 votes. Now, as winks and nods from Putin to Trump go, that's pretty clear. He doesn't know who Raffensperger is. I don't think anybody in Russia knows who he is, but he's now banned in Russia because of this. So that is a very clear sign of the way Putin is thinking. And of course, we know from the first 4 years that I don't know if there's a compromat. I do know that Donald Trump has never criticized Vladimir Putin, and I tend to believe that he never will. So yeah, I think I think there's still a lot of very powerful feeling in the West that we have to hold the line. So I believe on balance that we will. I think it'll become progressively more difficult, but we will. But if the US election leads to a Trump victory, then I think probably all bets are off. At a deeper level, I think, and just to finish on that small question, Jacques, I think the West has been very slow. It's not just the West. I mean, it's ridiculous that the permanent members of the UN Security Council are still the 5 members of the 1940s. I mean, the world has changed. I mean, if you're India, or if you're Germany, or if you're Brazil, or if you're South Africa, or if you're Egypt, and you look at a world where the only nations with a right to a veto are Britain, France, the United States, China, and Russia, and they are unprepared to broaden that club to reflect the actual state of the world today, you can see why the BRICS are angry. You can see why there's a wave of anti-French sentiment and pro-Russian sentiment in Africa. You can see why India has been neutral through this conflict. The world has changed quite radically, and it's going to go on changing in that direction, I believe. And I think the West has been very slow and reluctant to perceive the extent of that change and is paying a price. Yeah. I just would, I mean, I will, after your questions, I will read, if you'll allow me, a couple of short passages from the book. That's the only other element in this soiree thing.
Okay, well, I had a question about Russia, which I will skip because we will certainly come up maybe in your discussion. I wanted to ask you about your trip because you just mentioned you had met with Peskov and he gave you this astonishing answer about Russian democracy.
Yes, that's right. He said, yeah, he said that. I asked him about, the election, which is in April, the election that could leave Putin in power until 2030, which is then renewable for another 6 years, which would take him past Stalin as the rule in Russia. And he said, no, the election, that's not democracy, that's just bureaucracy. He said it's an expensive waste of time. And we know now that Vladimir Putin will get more than 90% of the vote. So that was a pretty extraordinary statement.
And made a great trailer for Roger's piece, because then everybody on the internet was looking for the New York Times piece, which was
a 6,300 word piece, by the way, which is
yeah,
unusual New York Times, and ran across 3.5 pages. So.
Yeah.
But I mean, I did feel very strongly that our coverage had become somewhat skewed by the fact that we were not getting. Again, going back to my first point, there's no substitute for the view from the ground. And however difficult it is to report from Russia, I think we have to try. Russia is a huge story. And it's one of the reflections of the hard lines being drawn in the world today, that our big bureau in Beijing and our big bureau in Moscow, that have been bureaus, of great importance and illustrious coverage by the New York Times over decades and decades and decades, are now unfortunately, and not of our doing, but they are diminished just by the state of world politics.
As we have, but I cannot leave you without asking a question about France, and you have actually several pieces about France. One of them is called the French Malaise. I forgot the exact. I think it was called the Glorious Malaise. And okay, glorious, I don't know, malaise certainly, and it's a polite way of putting it. And I would, therefore, my question is twofold. One is, many people, you might have noticed in this country, are a bit irritated or ill at ease with the way the New York Times is covering France, because they feel that this is a projection of American issues onto France, let's say the racial issue, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one part of it. But the more interesting about the malaise, I don't know when that column was written. I would say it's more than a malaise by now. Some people talk, okay, there is this whole literature about le déclin, déclinisme, etc. This whole discussion. There is a new issue of a French journal just come out on this subject. Of course, it's an old chestnut because since the 1930s, this discussion was going on, and it periodically resurfaces. So if you were not just to talk about the malaise, but about some of the deeper roots about where France is at and what its core problem is, as both having a president who wants to be the leader in Europe, but at the same time is internally rather constrained, to put it politely.
Well, malaise, of course, Jacques, is a French word, and I don't think that's a coincidence. One of the difficult things in France is to know how grenier, this habit of complaining, of grumbling, ils connaissent rien, ça vaut rien. You know, it goes through the whole series of gestures. It's very deeply ingrained. To know the degree to which it is actually deeply held and felt, and the extent to which that it's just part of living in France, I think is quite difficult. There is, sometimes I can't help feeling there's a somewhat, and I'm not, I hope, belittling the seriousness of the issues, an almost ritualistic aspect to some of life in France. I mean, we went through months and months of large-scale protests over President Macron's insistence that the retirement age be raised to 64 from 62, which is still well below the level in most European countries at this point, which is more like 66 or 67. And then, tous à la plage, et on n'en parle plus. Et on passe un mois très content dans la maison de campagne, voyageant, regardant la mer, et puis, oups, la rentrée, on va grogner de nouveau, on va, you know, and what is one to make of this? You know, how happy or unhappy are the French people really? I mean, il faut constater que vivre en France, c'est pas mal, hein? Enfin, il faut constater qu'on mange bien, on boit bien, et je ne parle pas que de la haute classe moyenne parisienne. Je veux dire, partout en France, je dirais que c'est pas mal, au fond. Enfin, but of course, there are serious issues. I mean, there's issues of exclusion, of unemployment, of a feeling. I think a lot of French people at this point, there's something about President Macron. I mean, they voted for him twice, but there is something in his personality, in the way that he handled the whole pension reform issue. He's never been able to get over the whole Jupiter thing, the aloofness, the feeling that he doesn't quite get it, that il n'est pas précisément comme nous. Enfin, il vient de quelque part. Who is this man? You know, this sort of feeling. I was struck talking. I don't know if any of you saw the piece I wrote on Clément Beaune, the profile of him I wrote the other day, the transportation minister who had this double coming out a couple of years ago as being gay and Jewish, and was recently in Odessa. His great-grandfather and two other relatives fled pogroms in Odessa in 1910 and ended up being deported by the Vichy government for Marseille, and ended up being deported by the Vichy government to their deaths at Auschwitz. Anyway, you know, Beaune is an interesting man. He talks about his personal life to explain his great passion for Europe and European ideas and European integration and European values, which resemble American values. And it got me thinking, you know, have we ever heard from President Macron a story, you know, about his life, about his family, about his parents, or where he grew up, or anything that sort of explains the position he is taking on something, or there's a stunning brilliance to him. But I think sometimes people feel this absence of an identifiable emotional core that, and I think that's troubling to some people. I may be completely wrong. It just struck me after the Bone piece. I think, you know, I think Macron on many levels, you know, the economy is pretty good shape. Unemployment is way down. Foreign investment is way up. The tech sector has been developed. There's a lot in France that's going well, but you know, a lot of people just feel unhappy with their lives, and why precisely they feel unhappy with their lives, I think, is the mystery that gave rise to a French word, malaise.
Well, France is a country where, which is a paradise, where half of the population think they're living in hell. So that's another way of putting the malaise. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacques. Yeah.
Thank you both, Jacques and Roger. That was wonderful. We are now going to open the discussion up to audience questions, and I'm already seeing eager hands shooting into the air. So Alfonso,
please raise your hand.
Thank you both for being here. My question was simply that I was delighted to hear that you would be reflecting on a life devoted to on-the-ground reporting, defending the free press, and writing for a shared humanity. Could you take a few moments just to do a little bit more talking about your own life and what your experiences have been like?
Well, alas, that experience is rather long at this point. And but yeah, I always was in the, you know, I liked to be an observer. I came to France very young when I was a student at Oxford, and I spent a year as an assistant in a lycée in Fresnes, actually. They told me it was Paris. I found myself next to a prison in Fresnes, taking the metro, which at the time was full of the whiff of Gauloise and Sauvignon Blanc at 7:30 in the morning, and I started to think I kind of like this. I kind of like being inside and outside at once. I was always taking notes and observing, and I figured that if I could persuade somebody to pay me to go out into the world and try to describe it, try to capture it, try to put them there, try to write in vivid and engaging ways that cause people ideally to pose questions about their own lives and their own societies, that would suit me very well. And I started out here in Paris, and I was seeing here at the library that you actually have a copy of all the editions of Paris Metro in the 1970s, which was a short-lived Village Voice, like, I don't know if any of you remember it, but it had a sort of succès of notoriété. Unfortunately, it was run by journalists, so the business side caused it to collapse after about 3 years. But anyway, that's where I was just being shown back here an article I wrote on the 10 best bars in Paris. It was the cover in 1978, which is 45 years ago. But anyway, I've wandered the earth at this point for quite a long time because, you know, that was in my nature. I spent my 18th birthday in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, having gone out there as a hippie. So it was just, you know, we are what we learn and we are our natures. And I was always curious. I wanted to look around the next corner. I wasn't satisfied with, you know, pat answers unless I could verify them for myself. I loved learning new languages, which was once easy for me and is now near impossible. But and so yes, I've you know, lived in South America, covered South America for quite a time, covered the fall of Pinochet, covered Sendero Luminoso in Peru, went to Machu Picchu alone. There was nobody else there when I went there, and you know, visited the great Serbian monasteries alone because it was the midst of the Bosnian War. And I mean, one secret of journalism is that behind every hellish Dateline, there lurks one great restaurant. And and we journalists tend to keep quiet about that because, you know, we want the hardship to be recognized in our compensation. But yeah, and I've done different things. I was the foreign editor of the New York Times, so I was running, and I became foreign editor. The announcement was made September 10, 2001. My first day in the job was 9/11. That was, you know, an amazing period. I mean, it was just, you know, overwhelming. I'll tell one quick anecdote and then leave it at that. There's so much I could drone on about. But there was, the work was just nonstop. I came out into Times Square on 9/11 and I was alone. It was empty. There was nobody there. Anyway, on about day 4 of this craziness, I came out and these images had started to go up of people who were lost, who had died, people that their relatives or loved ones were searching for, young men, young women, you know, every color, every race, you name it. And I was wandering into the 42nd Street subway, which had resumed functioning, and you know, I'd been a professional. I'm a pro. I want to be a pro. I think every journalist should aspire to those 3 letters. You know, there's no point in writing the greatest story on earth if you can't get it into deadline. You know, it's just no point. You know, so I'd been that. You know, but I'm me also. And there was this. It was a woman's ultrasound, and you could see the fetus, and underneath it was written. Looking for the father of this child. And I just, I mean, I just lost it, you know. And, you know, that's what I was talking about at the beginning. You know, we're pros and we're human beings. And I think as a human being, you are enriched by what at least used to be the life of a journalist, which is to wander the earth, you know, seeking wisdom and enlightenment. Long answer, sorry.
Is it possible for United States of America to break what you've called East Bloc, the alliance between Russia and China? In other words, at the end of the day, what matters more to United States, saving Ukraine or in few years saving Taiwan?
So the beginning of your question was, is it possible for the United States to
break the alliance between Russia and China?
Oh, to split them?
Lines, because
break the alliance. Okay, sorry. I thought you said lines. Yeah, okay, got it. I don't think so. I think there's a pretty strong feeling in wide areas of the world that the United States had its moment. I think that's to underestimate the United States. No country is as capable of reinvention, constant churn and reinvention as the United States. Still a relatively empty country with a population of, you know, approaching 350 million, but not 1.3 or 1.4 billion. So, but I don't think those countries which still see an American-dominated world and see it as their objective to put an end to that period of history. And I think, judging from my trip to Moscow, where, you know, the degree of anti-Western invective is at an extraordinary level today, and it goes to our whole, you know, in the eyes of Russia, the United States or the West is decadent. It's the home of LGBTQ. It's the home of all these deviations from church, family, nation. Never mind that Russia has the highest divorce rate in the world, and I've never anywhere come across more single women raising children bravely in adverse circumstances on their own. But that's, you know, that's the myth. That's what Putin is fostering. So no, I don't think it will be possible in the near term, at least, and probably the medium term, to break that alliance. Taiwan, we'll see. You know, Taiwan is more critical to the West by far than in some ways than Ukraine. Certainly economically, I mean, not in terms of the broad ideological struggle in which I think, you know, avoiding a Ukrainian defeat and, if possible, securing a Ukrainian victory is absolutely essential. But Taiwan is, I mean, much of the semiconductor industry is based in Taiwan. And you know, President Biden certainly hinted that the United States would not stand by. But of course, none of us wants World War III. And that's why the United States has not put troops on the ground in Ukraine, and nor has any Western nation. And you know, that would be a huge dilemma if China were to do that. My own view is that China will not, for the simple reason that it's eyeing the next 20 years, perhaps, 2050, let's say, and eyeing becoming the most powerful country on earth, and does not believe that war or full-scale war of the kind that an invasion of Taiwan would probably provoke, does not believe that is compatible with that objective.
A question from a fellow journalist, Roger. As someone who presents and produces a women's program, I do say I have a problem with the opening line of the American Declaration of Independence. Mainly, all men are created equal. I think we tend to forget that there are other genders obviously involved as well. However, my question to you is this. I was in Kentucky last October doing a special on the battle for abortion rights in the lead up to the American midterms. And as a result, I met many activists, young activists on the ground, and heard some very disturbing stories. One of whom was in Frankfort, the state capital of Kentucky, on January 6th, who was very friendly with the police commissioner, who rang the local police commissioner because of obviously what was going on, and was told to stay indoors along with her fellow activists because of the number of young men in pickup trucks going around the town with guns. With that in mind, and with what you've just said, my question to you is America heading to a point where there will be another civil war?
Well, thank you for that question. I hope not, and I believe not, but I think it comes back to what I was saying. I mean, there are 60% of Americans who are supporting the former president, who winked at, encouraged, inflamed, to some degree mobilized that violent assault on our democracy. So, I mean, there's a column from Colorado where about, you know, time for liberals to gun up before the previous election, which I thought looked very dangerous and proved to be. And I think instead of abating with Biden, and of course, remember his inaugural, he talked about bringing the country together. But it seems to be impossible right now to bring the United States together. And so is there a danger of violence? Is violence in the air? Yes, it is. A fully fledged civil war? I don't think so. American institutions did hold. They did hold. They were tested, severely tested, and they held. And we have a history of more than 200 years of them holding. 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is approaching in 2026. So, but it's very troubling, and the violence in American society is a very troubling issue. The whole gun culture, I think, is very hard for Europeans to understand, and goes back to the country's founding, and goes. Yeah. To me, the Second Amendment, you know, it's pretty clear when you read it. I mean, the right to bear arms is related to having a strong militia. Strong militia. It's not related, you know, to people, individuals wandering around schools with AK-47s or whatever. So, but a lot of people read the Second Amendment another way, a huge number of people. I don't see how it can be read that way, but there we are. But as I said, I still believe, despite everything, in America's capacity for renewal, and I think Joe Biden has done quite a lot in Asia and in Europe and elsewhere to reassure allies that that those values that define the American idea remain important. The damage done by Trump has not gone away, but there's been a partial healing, I think we better stop the questions at that point. If I was going to read to sort of...
Please, you must.
Okay.
We have a quick round of applause for that answer before.
Read two short passages, one on Putin, one on Trump, and then a more personal section from the introduction. This is from a column called Western Illusions over Ukraine, which dates from February 2015, i.e. 8 years ago, more 8.5 years ago. And it was obviously after the annexation of Crimea and the Russian infiltration of the Donbass. And I wrote 8.5 years ago, it's time to get real over Putin. He's not poured tanks and multiple launch rocket systems over the Ukrainian border because he's about to settle for anything less than a weak Ukraine, sapped by low-level conflict in the Donetsk region, a country with its very own pro-Russian enclave, a la Abkhazia or Transnistria, firmly within the Russian sphere of influence, the symbol of his definitive strategic turn away from closer cooperation with the West toward the confrontation that shores him up as oil prices and the currency plunge. He will not let Ukraine go. There is a language Moscow understands: anti-tank missiles, battlefield radars, reconnaissance drones, bolster the Ukrainian army with them and other arms, change Putin's cost-benefit analysis. There are risks, but no policy is risk-free. Recall that Ukraine gave up more than 1,800 nuclear warheads in exchange for that bogus commitment from Russia in 1994 to respect its sovereignty and its borders. Surely it has thereby earned the right to something more than night vision goggles. The West's current Ukraine diplomacy is long on illusion and short on realism. 2 + 2 = 4 in war and peace. Well, one of the things as a columnist is you write things and nobody pays any attention. I mean, that is the basic rule of being a columnist. But I did write that. And this was Trump's Weimar America. This was also in December 2015. Welcome to Weimar America. It's getting restive in the beer halls. People are sick of politics as usual. They want blunt talk. They want answers. Welcome to an angry nation, stung by 2 lost wars, its politics veering to the extremes, its mood vengeful, beset by decades of stagnant real wages for most people, tempted by a strongman who would keep all Muslims out, and vows to restore American. We're going to be so tough and so mean and so nasty, Donald Trump says. People roar. He calls for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. People roar. People want strength, he says. People roar. His poll numbers go up. Pundits, even the longtime guru of Republican political branding, Karl Rove, shake their heads. Trump is a clown. No, he is not. He is in earnest, and he's onto something. It's foolish not to take him seriously. A near perfect storm for his rabble-rousing is upon the United States. China is rising. American power is ebbing. The tectonic plates of global security are shifting. Afghanistan and Iraq have been the graveyards of glory. There is fear after the killing in California inspired by the Islamic State. of an enemy within. The Europeanization of American politics is also the Europeanization of political risk. The unthinkable has happened in Europe. It is not impossible in America. It would be wrong not to take Trump very seriously. It would be irresponsible. It would be to forget European history from whose fascist example he borrows. In Weimar America, politics are not what they were. The establishment looks tired. The establishment has not understood the fact-light theater of the contemporary world. The Weimar Republic ended with a clown's ascent to power, a high-energy buffoon who shouted loudest, a bully from the beer halls, a racist and a bigot. He was an outsider given to theatrics and pageantry. He seduced the nation of Beethoven. He took the world down with him. I need to adjust my glasses. And this in a totally different and very personal vein, I hope not too much so. It's a section called Excavation from the introduction. We all die, my mother gone, my father gone now. There is no preparation for the loneliness of a world from which the two people who put you in it have gone. The death of parents removes the last cushion against contemplation of your own mortality. The cycle of life becomes internal, bone-deep knowledge, a source now of melancholy, now of inspiration. This, above all, to thine own self be true. My mother often said that. What happens to a dream deferred, asks Langston Hughes in his poem Harlem. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or maybe it just sags like a heavy load? Or does it explode? The wick is lit, the clock is ticking, taking you backward, always backward, into the sterile patterns of yourself denied. There is always somebody else. There is always the next distraction, detour. Always also the debris after the explosion. No, not that. It is time. To write is violent combat in search of the irrefutable cadence. There is more to be abjured than added, more truth in distillation than accumulation. To write is loneliness. It is excavation. It is struggle for declarative sentences that hammer out discomforting truths. Working from a core of pain and melancholy, it's not surprising that I sought out those emotions in refugee camps, in war zones, at remote borders, in the shanties and the shebeens, at the face of a South African gold reef 1 mile down, in Chengdu, where a Chinese woman crushed by the state had self-immolated, among the displaced and exploited and the terrified. That was my place, that my debt. Take me home, the outcast whispered, you who have none. Why, I wondered, did they look at me with such intensity? Was it recognition I saw in the eyes of the lost of the earth? Hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. Baudelaire's line taken up by T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland. Hypocrite reader, my fellow, my brother. Objectivity is a fine word, a fine journalistic aspiration even, but it is a dead word, freighted with too many syllables, and we are human. We bring to what we write our own unique sensibilities, our wounds, our sisters and brothers. We bring our hypocrisies too, and if we fail to do so, we become uninteresting. If I wanted my readers to accompany me through life, they needed clues. Half-tones interested me more than primary colors. Van Gogh's flowers are always wilting slightly. His lilies have turned from pink to purple and are a little brownish on the edges. The artist is interested in the beauty of the equipoise between life and death. And isn't that where we are all situated without paying much attention to it? Van Gogh is less taken by perfection than by decay. Ours is a culture of perfection, of all or nothing, of primary colors and primal screams, a presumption of guilt, of unforgiving trial by the mob, proud in its refusal to compromise, and so it is broken. Florists cut the stamens out of lilies because the pollen stains, but as some lilies wilt, others bloom with their pale green and crimson stamens. It's important to live with the stains. As Leonard Cohen observed, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. It's the deviation from strict symmetry that imbues the Parthenon with the pulse of life. The folds and pleats of Athenian statuary are supple. That is why they are alive. The human pulse is not a metronome. We are not storage devices. We inhabit the intermediate zones. The human timber is crooked, and as Immanuel Kant observed, out of it no straight thing was ever made. Isaiah Berlin wrote in The Crooked Timber of Humanity, no perfect solution is, not merely in practice, but in principle, possible in human affairs, and any determined attempt to produce it is likely to lead to suffering, disillusionment, and failure. Democracy is imperfect, and in that imperfection lies its distinctive humanity, its beauty, its elasticity, its terrifying fragility, the quality that every quest for utopia ends up crushing on the way to terror. Sometimes, wandering around the archaeological ruins of Greece, I've wondered, does the caryatid in her stoic grace even know the burden she carries? We might ask the same of democracy and the miracles it undergirds. Thank you.